Right now, 1 month has passed since the horrific shooting at an elementary school shook our nation and spurred a renewed focus on gun violence in our country. So what, if anything, will change in Newtown's wake? Tomorrow, the president gets Joe Biden's report. And next, President Obama, he had some harsh words today for those who are standing in the way of raising the nation's debt limit. He said that we are not a deadbeat nation. We'll bring you back to some of the more powerful sound today and discuss. And later, more than 2 months have passed since Superstorm Sandy slammed into our region, and yet D.C. is still debating whether or not to pay for reconstruction. If D.C. can't even agree on that, what can they agree on? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us this Monday evening, January 14th. As I said, it has been exactly 1 month since the Newtown shooting, and in that time, we have come to know the faces of the fallen, and we have watched as parent after parent said their just emotionally wrenching goodbyes to their little loved ones far, far too soon. We saw those tiny caskets after tiny casket lowered into the ground, but now, well, now there is a conversation and some soul searching for solutions here. Parents of victims, they spoke out today for the first time, calling for action and hope in the face of tragedy. Fox 1's news reporter Carolyn Fortino, she was there and she joins us live now from Newtown with the very latest. Carolyn?
Good evening, Rich. Parents joined together today for a moment of silence to remember their children, speaking out publicly for the first time since the tragic Sandy Hook shooting. Now, today they announced the launch of Sandy Hook Promise exactly 1 month after they said goodbye to their loved ones all too soon. Now, the Sandy Hook Promise is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help the healing process for Newtown families by creating a national dialogue about school safety, mental health illness, and gun violence.
I still find myself reaching for Dylan's hand to walk through a car parking lot, or expecting him to crawl into bed beside me for early morning cuddles before we get ready for school. It's so hard to believe he's gone. This is a promise we make to our precious children, because each child, every human life, is filled with promise, and though we continue to be filled with unbearable pain, we choose love, belief, and hope instead of anger.
I would respectfully request that every parent in this country who hears these words simply pause for a moment and think. Ask yourself, what is it worth doing to keep your children safe?
Now, the Sandy Hook Promise begins with the words, "Our hearts are broken, our spirits are not." If you want to find out more information about the Sandy Hook Pledge, you can log onto our website. In Newtown, I'm Carolyn Fortino. Rich, let's send it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. Now, guns were on everyone's mind today, from Newtown to Washington and beyond. President Obama, he spoke about the need for better gun violence prevention measures during his press conference earlier today in our nation's capital.
The belief that we have to have stronger background checks, that we can do a much better job in terms of keeping these magazine clips with high capacity out of the hands of folks who shouldn't have them, an assault weapons ban that is meaningful, that those are things I continue to believe make sense. Okay, will all of them get through this Congress? I don't know. If there is a step we can take that will save even one child from what happened in Newtown, we should take that step.
Now, it wasn't just obviously at the scene of this horror, or for that matter, from our commander-in-chief, but you have so many stakeholders in this conversation. And in Baltimore, you had gun policy experts who got together at Johns Hopkins University talking about solutions, and not surprisingly, one of its most famous alma mater, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who co-chairs the Mayors Against Illegal Guns and who has opened his checkbook on this issue. He also opened the two-day summit.
The rate of firearms homicide in America is 20 times higher than it is in other economically advanced nations. We have got to change that, and it has to start this week with real leadership from the White House.
Now, a series of recommendations from the summit, they'll be released Tuesday afternoon. The same day, a task force headed up by the vice president is expected to offer its proposals to President Obama. Now, here's the measures that Bloomberg's group are working and pushing. 7 in total here, 3 that would require legislation, and 4 that only require the John Hancock of the president, executive action. First, the ones that would have to get Congress involved. That's a background check for all gun sales. Second, would be make gun trafficking a federal crime. And the third one, to limit the availability of military-style weapons in high-capacity magazines. Translation, assault weapons and those clips. Now, next, these are the ones that, again, would require only executive order. First, to order all federal agencies to submit necessary data to the National Background Check Database. Second, to direct the Department of Justice to make prosecuting convicted criminals who provided false personal information during purchase of background checks a priority. And to give you a frame of reference, there was more than 80,000 that were flagged, but yet only about 44 have actually been prosecuted in any way, shape, or form. Goes on to say the president could also appoint an ATF director. And fourth, to stop supporting the so-called Tie-Hard Order, which is a law that keeps information about gun traffickers from the public. Now, the vice president, he is working on a little bit of a different game plan, and this is much as we've learned for what he's signaling that he will propose to the president, and that is a stronger background checks for all gun purchases, a high-capacity magazine clip ban, the reinstatement of that assault weapons ban, and also strengthening mental health checks. President, he signaled today that he would also pursue that assault weapons ban. The NRA, however, says he may want to do it, but it's not going to happen.
The likelihood is that they're not going to be able to get an assault weapons ban through this Congress.
All right, so the question is, what should our nation's new gun violence legislation look like? And joining us to sound off on this, Richard Brodsky, former New York Assemblyman, senior fellow at Demos, professor at NYU, and a columnist in a paper near you. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Mark Rosen, veteran of not only the war in Afghanistan, but also an assistant professor at West Point and a former congressional candidate in his own right, and our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. And I'll start first with you, Richard, and if I said a month ago that the likelihood is that the NRA is right, forget what the president wants, an assault weapons ban by most people doing head counts today will not pass this Congress, would you have believed it?
Yeah, I think you can't.
Even a month ago.
Yeah, the power of the NRA and the extreme ideology of a good portion of the House, plus the filibuster 60-member rule that Republicans enforced in the Senate, I've always thought made it a long shot. But the interesting thing is to know whether the American people, the president, or anybody is in this for the long haul. What happens in the next week or 10 days, what legislation passes, is the beginning of a process. One of the things I would love to see, no one's yet discussing, is the Skyfall technology, where a gun could only be fired if your palm print was found to be on the heel of the gun. Those kinds of things, which are technologically difficult now, are going to become possible. And that's where you're going to find, I think, the kind of things that you can enact into law that'll actually make a difference.
Do we guys have the clips of some of the governors, including from our region? Okay, Dominic, I want you to take a listen to governors from our region that have used a much different tone than we heard earlier today from the president, or frankly from a lot of lawmakers, and these from recent State of the State addresses. So let's take a look.
It will ban military assault weapons that have no place on the streets of Baltimore or on any other neighborhood in our state. And it will also limit the size of magazines in order to make it harder for criminals to gun down in succession police officers or school children.
Freedom is not a handgun on the hip of every teacher, and security should not mean a guard posted outside every classroom.
No one hunts with an assault rifle. No one needs 10 bullets to kill a deer. And too many innocent people have died already. End the madness now. Pass safe, reasonable gun control in the state of New York.
All right, Dominic, two very different approaches here, but you saw Governors O'Malley from Maryland and also the Connecticut and New York governors we just saw there, Malloy and Cuomo. And Malloy getting choked up at points here, talking in his address. We covered it that night. How should the president, should he take that incremental approach that Richard's talking about, to practically take what you can get right now?
No.
Or should he use a tone like we heard from them?
I don't think he's going to use a tone like we've heard from governors representing northern states. I think that this president in particular is going to take an approach where he's going to try and embrace everyone. But he's got to put everything on the table. The small piecemeal simply is unacceptable with these 20 babies that are now in the ground because of what happened. He's going to go big picture. Richard may be right. I hope he's wrong. They may get the votes. It may look that way right now. But let's put it on the table. Make them vote no. And let's see where these senators and where these members of Congress stand on this issue.
You know, there's been a lot of polls on this, and I think to the frustration of many, America's conflicted on this, even after Newtown, Andrew. But one poll that surprised me a little bit was, in recent weeks, support for an assault weapons ban has grown, if you look at polls in this country. Is it how it's positioned? Is it that the challenge is people an assault weapon can mean two different things to two different people? Or is it that, you know, you got the most vocal folks there that some people think speak for all gun owners when they don't?
I think, like so many political issues, part of this is how the question is framed, how the issues are being framed, who's got the dominant argument. So I think you're going to find polls out that say people want an assault weapons ban, and I think you could just as easily find polls that say people aren't convinced of an assault weapons ban. And just speaking to Dominic's comment, I think the president's going to have to go incrementally because, as Richard pointed out, I don't think there's a whole lot of support for this in Congress to get a grand package together on gun control. And if the goal here really is
are you suggesting, Andrew, though, that he introduces them separately but still introduces an assault weapons ban, or only introduced in a package what he thinks will pass?
It's 6 1/2 a dozen.
Oh, no,
it would be nice to put them on.
No. If the president doesn't offer up an assault weapons ban, forget about whether it passes or not. There will a lot of people be outraged in this country.
It would be nice for the president to put Republicans on the record and having to vote down an assault weapons ban, or Democrats for that matter as well. But you know, if he does that, that may disengender enough, enough negative attitude in the whole thing that he can't even get the smaller things that he's looking for. And the goal, he said, is preventing the death of even one child. That means piecemeal.
You know, one of the quotes that stood out to me was General McChrystal on this conversation, who said, I know these weapons. I've been on a battlefield. They belong on a battlefield. And I've seen certain law enforcement officials, police chiefs from around this country, say similar things, but yet powerful things, talking about what their men and women in uniform have encountered. I sometimes think the voices in this conversation, even a month later, the ones that would have the biggest impact haven't been heard enough. With all due respect to Mayor Bloomberg, he's not going to convince somebody in middle America, or for that matter, change a politician's mind, maybe. Do you think so as well?
I totally agree. I think McChrystal speaking and people, police forces, whatever, getting out there and saying, why do you need an M16 or AK-47 or whatever the assault weapon is? It makes no sense. I actually think if you look at the proposals by Bloomberg, by the president, what they're talking about is completely reasonable as a supporter of the Second Amendment. We need to tone it down, but we also need to have balance in this conversation. This conversation is, a lot of this will have marginal impact. There's other things we should do. I agree with Andrew. Go big. Go big. Get it all on the table, but don't forget the other things that could have a bigger impact on reducing these heinous crimes.
And I think if they can avoid saying Democrat or Republican, and they can also talk about the culture of violence and the different mediums it's shown in, mental health is an element too. You don't demonize one side that could be convinced that some restrictions don't amount to a gun grab. You know, I think you're right.
If it's a crisis, you treat it like a crisis and you do everything you can think of to try to make a difference. If not, it's just political opportunism.
But they are using the opportunity of the moment.
Yes.
And that screaming absolutely turns people off. It says somebody's running for something, and people start to run. Let's have serious conversation.
Keep this conversation going online. Please go to Facebook and Twitter, sound off. What do you think should happen to probably one of the more contentious elements of this, which is the assault weapons ban? Should it be reinstated? We jump to a quick break. But when we come back, the star of Obama's press conference today was the debt limit. If you didn't hear what he had to say, he used some pretty stark terms to talk about the consequences if it is not extended. When we come back, we'll discuss that, and also If you were the president, what would you do? Stay with us.